Well, thank you very much for coming. As Woody says, I will try and speak for 30 to 40 minutes, but I have a lot of slides. I've done everything I'm not supposed to do in this presentation. First have a lot of slides and then talk about different ideas rather than one or two. So let me just begin by saying that this is a dissertation for the E-IPER program. This is an interdisciplinary program in environment and resources here at Stanford, associated with the Earth School. And the topic I would like to speak to you about is the global diffusion of conservation policy using an institutional analysis. And I'll explain what I mean by institutional analysis as we go along. I have some diagrams you'll see, and you can stop me, I think, if something's unclear, because I'll probably go quite fast with some of these diagrams. Okay? So let me introduce briefly my concerns, and then I'll present a structure of the presentation, which follows more or less the chapters in the dissertation. But let me just first introduce the problem. And this is a broad problem, and I'll specifically use conservation policy as an example. But the question is the following. What we've observed in the last century, and specifically in the last 30 to 40 years, is this just incredible process of what's known as convergence in environmental policy. That is the diffusion and adoption of a series of environmental policy forms, be they organizations, environmental policies, around the world. Now, the question is why? What explains this just incredible diffusion of these policies? Secondly, what explains the change in those environmental policy forms? And finally, what determines the effectiveness of those environmental policy forms? Now, this is a very broad question. But what we observe in general is that many of these policy forms, and here I have two examples, ministries or environmental agencies and legislation, in the case of Latin America, which is my main area of focus, that they tend to be similar, a ministry or an environmental agency or an environmental-based law, and they tend to be at the same time. So we tend to have a convergence in environmental policies, and these environmental policies tend to occur at the same time, or they tend to be adopted at the same time. So now, in the case of conservation policy, we have a particular interest because conservation policy is perhaps the longest environmental policy across the world. And secondly, it's perhaps the most emblematic because it's related to how we conceive and understand the environment in general, the natural environment. So some of these environmental concerns, or conservation concerns, to just characterize what's going on, we have that they are globally diffused and highly legitimated. Secondly, that there is low enforcement, or a term I will use consistently, they are highly decoupled. That is, there is a difference between the formal environmental policy and the practical environmental policy, the implementation. Third, they are associated with specific policy models. In particular, in the case of conservation, they're associated with what's known as the national park. So specifically, my questions associated with conservation is what explains the emergence of these conservation concerns, what explains the diffusion of these policy models, in this case the national park, and finally, what explains the change in those accepted models. Typically, we think, for example, of the national park as a policy model that has diffused, but in fact, the national park, as I'll explain, has changed considerably in the last 20 to 30 years. Whereas before the national park was conceived as this area without people, today it's very much conceived as an organization with a relationship with the local communities and with especially people involved. Here we have the typical standard diagram of organizational theorists and scholars, which in this case is for national parks, but it can be with any organization. And you see this exponential curve in which you see an expansion of the adoption of this organization, in this case the national park, this just remarkable diffusion of the national park. Here we have the first period, which is 1872, considered the first date of the first national park with Yellowstone. And then you see as it diffuses across the world. You'll see that in different colors here, we have different regions. So whereas before, national parks were concentrated in the United States and Western Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, then as we move on, they move towards Asia and other periphery countries. So why is it that the national park, and I think of the national park as a metaphor for just organizations associated with environment, have expanded so considerably? So I will introduce this, I've already done that, then I will change a little bit the structure of my thesis for my committee. This is chapter 8. I'll briefly introduce that now, and then I'll move to the structure of explaining why I think this is an interesting question. So first I'll move on to diffusion, then I'll talk a little bit about theory, and then I will talk about a series of concepts associated with field theory. My argument will be that it's a good way of thinking about this is with institutional theory, and especially social field theory, and that the questions are, how does this new field emerge? How is it constructed? How is it integrated to the rest of the world? The idea of embeddedness. How does it evolve and change? The idea of structuration. How does it become legitimate? And how is it implemented across the world? Okay, so I will try and be as brief as possible and go through these kind of long structures. So the first question is really that, in a sense, it's the final question. So once these institutions become legitimated, once they become turned into a field, once they become legitimated, they diffuse. But I want to start with diffusion because I think it poses the question very well. And scholars, international scholars and scholars in organizational theory have wondered about the issue of diffusion, this issue of what I've called convergence. How policies, why is it that policies across the world are so similar? Why is it that these policies have been adopted and adapted at similar periods of times, as I illustrated with the case of environmental laws and with agencies and ministries? And essentially there are two answers to that. One is autonomous. That is, each country has a problem and has autonomously, without considering other countries, adopted the policy solution. But nobody really believes that because these policies are so similar. So the second group of ideas associated with explaining this idea of convergence is associated with some transnational connectedness. So countries, nation states, organizations, you can think, are somehow influenced by what's going on around them. And essentially we have 5 arguments used to explain this idea of connectedness or this influence with the different organizations, the different nation states. One is harmonization, such as the processes in the European Union. Countries tend to harmonize their policies. Another one is imposition or coercion. One country or one international organization imposes policies on other countries, as in the case of the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. Third, regulatory competition. Countries reduce their regulations as a consequence of competition across the world to attract investment. Therefore, they tend to converge towards similar policies. But in the case of national parks and the environment, I will argue there are 2 essential processes which are probably the most likely. One is learning, and the other one is what I've called emulation. In the case of learning, what we're saying is essentially that countries have a problem, an environmental problem, and they want to solve it, and they go to the international community and see what's the best solution to solve it. So there's a transnational connectedness that's relevant on the one hand, but on the other hand, they have a specific problem which they want to solve. The second case is associated with new institutional theory in world society, it's called specifically, and there have been quite a few studies on this in the case of the environment. It's called emulation. In this case, countries do not have specific problems necessarily, but countries are adopting what are perceived to be legitimate policies, legitimate environmental policies, because they seek to be legitimate actors in a global community. Now, the main mechanism associated with emulation is the idea to conform, and in the same way as individuals or organizations nation states are trying to conform to these global normative pressures. There's a lot of evidence for this. I did a very brief analysis of the diffusion process, and I'll show you some of the results here. But just to get you some intuition about this, here we have not the accumulated number of protected areas, but the actual number of protected areas in different 5-year periods. And as you'll see here, you have very low numbers of protected areas every 5 years, and here there's a couple of peaks. And they seem to be related to these international environmental events. Johannesburg, Rio, the Brunt Report of Sustainable Development, and so forth. A series of events, the Club of Rome and the foundation of UNEP, among others. So there seems to be some correlation between the establishment of these national parks and protected areas, or the establishment of a series of policies with these international events, suggesting perhaps that there is some kind of normative pressures at the global level. Now, I'll go through this very quickly because it's not my main question here. Typically, these studies have been using event history analysis. I used the negative binomial regression model, that is a count model. The reason I used the negative binomial is because the Poisson, which is more commonly used for these count models, there is over-dispersion. And I used data covering the period 1960 to 2007, and the question was, well, can we think about some, it's a very busy diagram, I'm sorry about this, but can we think about some of these variables? Can we use some proxies, some variables for proxies to think about some of these mechanisms and to give us some intuition with respect to what are the mechanisms associated with this convergence process? This model is consistent with other models that is in the literature, and they generally tend to agree with what I've have here. Now, you'll see different models here, Model 1, Model 2, Model 3, and Model 4. They're related to different variables, and these variables are proxies for those different mechanisms I try to identify. Now, here you'll find some control variables. The dependent variable is the count number of protected areas by nation state. So if a nation state has in country one, in year one, 5 protected areas, that would be there. In year 2, 0 protected areas, that would be there, and so forth. Here we have a series of control variables considering the nation state, characterizing the nation states. Surface area, real GDP, and lagged cumulative surface area of protected areas to show dependency. The learning mechanism, which I identified at the beginning, is associated with 2 proxies. One is hotspots, which is a variable very familiar to environmental scientists. It's the idea that identified by a famous ecologist group, Myers, that countries have areas which are especially valuable in terms of the environment and which are threatened. So they're called hotspots, and I used a dummy for those. A second variable I use for the learning mechanism is the primary energy consumption as an indication of pollution. So the idea here is simply to say, well, do these countries have some kind of environmental problem that could justify their establishment of protected areas? The second group of variables are associated with the emulation mechanism. That is the connection, the transnational connection between these countries. And here we have 4 indicators. One is membership in conventional international organizations, the UN and so forth. The second one is membership in international environmental government organizations, that is UNEP and so forth. The third one is what I mentioned, international environmental events as a dummy, and I also used the communist government dummy. The idea behind the communist government is that countries that were within the Soviet bloc in this period are less connected to the world global cultural system. Then we have a normative mechanism associated with the number of cumulative protected areas in the region, and a coercive mechanism associated with aid as a percentage of GDP lag. Now, there's a series of problems with these variables, but it does give you an important indication. And we see here that, unsurprisingly, in the different models, total territory is relevant, is statistically significant. Now, here I've put the coefficients of the IRR, that is the incidence rate ratio, which is, in the case of the negative binomial, it is similar to coefficients. So you should interpret this, if it's greater than 1, it's a positive effect. If it's less than 1, it's a negative effect. So what we find is that territory size is unsurprisingly very significant. None of these learning mechanism variables are significant, suggesting that countries are not adopting protected areas as a consequence of their environmental problems. Now, this is very important and consistent with other types of analysis, statistical analysis. But look at these emulation mechanisms. We have that membership in conventional international organizations is significant across, that should have been significant as well, and positive. So if you're associated with the international system, you're more likely to adopt a protected area. But not so not so membership in international environmental government organizations, suggesting that countries that have problems do not necessarily access the international system associated with environmental protection, but simply the connection to the international system gives them the pressure or suggests to them the idea of establishing a protected area. Also note the statistical significance across models of international environmental events, and also in most models the idea of the number of cumulative protected areas. So all of them are statistically significant. So this is strong evidence suggesting that emulation mechanisms are important in having or establishing protected areas across the world. What does that tell us? Now that's an interesting result, but it's a result that I've replicated, is consistent with other work. So these, in effect, these results suggest that the countries have normative pressures, and that the international system does generate those pressures to impose on them, if you will, culturally, the idea of protected areas. Now the problem with this is just that this isn't really very interesting, to be honest. It's a result that we've replicated. The problem is that, of course, global institutional norms affect social action. Of course, they construct actors. And of course, there is a pressure to adopt these legitimated policies. The question is, where do these institutions come from? Where did the idea of the national park come from, and why did it diffuse? Not how did it diffuse. And how did these conservation concerns arise? Why is it that the national park is the paradigmatic, emblematic organizational form associated with in situ conservation? So there we have to go back to the theory and think about institutional issues. And that is why I consider this an institutional analysis. So I will move on very briefly to a theoretical framework, and fortunately, or unfortunately for me, we have the main theorist on institutional theory and organizational fields here. So let me just briefly say that some of the analytical concepts. The first analytical concept to think about institutions. And we understand institutions not only as the rules of the game, as is typically understood, but also as norms and cultural constructs, in the sense that institutions frame the way we think about the world. Secondly, I'm using the concept of organizational fields. Organizational fields is a concept with increasing relevance in social science and with a certain resurgence in recent years. Essentially, these are social spaces in which individuals interact, and that interaction generates common meaning systems. Finally, the idea of structuration, which is a difficult word to say, but essentially it means as these individuals interact, there is a process of what's known as isomorphism. There is a process in which these different communities of organizations or individuals become more similar. And it is these processes that explain the convergence in these policy forms. So my point of departure is to say, well, let's accept the argument of the world society folks in the institutional theory. Let's accept the fact that the diffusion of environmental policy forms is associated with these connections towards the global economy or the global cultural system, and that these institutions are associated with these cultural norms. They have an idea of environmental regime. So the concept is that there's an environmental regime out there, constructed somehow, which gives you the principal tenets of the policy forms that we should take. And then there's diffusion as a consequence of these emulation process. So the imagery is top-down. This world environmental regime is constructed, it's created, and the domestic environmental movements are both constructed, as well as the national policies forms. Now, the problem with this, I will argue, is it just doesn't tell us very much. On the one hand, this view coming from these scholars is that it's unidirectional. There is no relationship between the nation states and the environmental regime. Secondly, there's no concern for emergence. Where did the environmental regime come from? Third, there's no view of change. How does the environmental regime change? And as I observed with the case of national parks, what we'll see is that the national park, though called the same thing, is radically different from what it was at the beginning of the century. The regime is static. The actors in the periphery are what are known as cultural dupes. They accept what's coming from the regime without any interaction. So my concern about this is to think about the conservation regime in terms of a more institutional process in which agents and actors have a role to play, and they influence the regime as the regime influences them. That is a process of structuration. So I will move on to emergence, evolution, and structuration and embeddedness, and to think about how the regime has evolved and what influence it has on the different actors that are involved. A better way of looking at this, in my view, is to think about the world environmental regime as being constructed and emerging, to influence national policy forms, to construct social movements, NGOs, as suggested by neo-institutional theory in world society, but that there's a process of structuration at the field level domestically in different countries, which depends on the institutional context of these countries, which not only explains or determines the de facto environmental policies, but also generates the condition to become and perceive environmental problems. And in turn, this process affects the world environmental regime, changing it, having a new environmental regime in a second stage. So in a sense, you can think of the national park model emerging from this regime, affecting nation states as they react to it, and then the national park regime changing and evolving and then affecting. This is typically considered a structuration process. Emergence. Now, let me briefly speak about emergence because I think this is very interesting, and we are in the United States, and the United States is key in this. Conservation concerns arose in the United States and in Europe simultaneously, but they arose as a consequence of different trends and problems. In the case of the United States, the image we have of the environment is the image that comes from wilderness. It's Yosemite, it's Yellowstone. There are no people here. It's the snow-capped mountain, the river, and the forest. In the case of Europe, the idea of the environment was very much species-related, and there is a reason for that. The reason is that on the one hand, the United States has been considered by scholars for quite a while, an environmental historian, has to do with the evolving concept of wilderness, which originally was very hostile. And as the frontier closed, as the process of enlightenment, the scientific revolution, and transcendentalism influenced American concepts of nature, it evolved into something more benign. Even the English concept of wilderness is slightly different from the American concept of wilderness. So it's not even a language issue, it's very much related to the American construction of the American social construction of the natural environment. We have evidence for that in the case of dictionaries. And we see that in the Johnson Dictionary of 1755, while wilderness was considered a tract of solitude and savageness, a state of being wild or disorderly, today the idea of wilderness is something uninhabited, uncultivated region. It's something more benign, less aggressive, less savage. This is only in the case of the English language. In the case of Spanish, for instance, we do not have a word for wilderness. The word for wilderness would be something like savage nature, which has no benign concept associated with it. In the case of the European conception of the environment, they were very much concerned about species. They were not concerned of the great wilderness. They were especially associated with white elite hunters who wanted to conserve areas because they wanted to protect species, because they wanted to conserve their hunting grounds. So in one case, we have the emergence of conservation concerns associated with a very specific cultural process in the case of the United States, what institutional theorists would call an ideational process, because it involves the changing concept of wilderness. But in the case of Europe, and especially Great Britain, what we have is what institutional scholars would call agency. Specific individuals promoting conservation as a consequence of their interest to conserve species. It is these two views that converge. Initially, and here I have a list, I know you can't see that very well, but here we have a series of organizations in Europe and in the United States that were concerned with conservation in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. From 1887, with the famous Boone and Crockett Club associated with Theodore Roosevelt, to the International Union of Nature Protection, which I will speak about. It is these individuals that their names are repeated time and time again, and who are the individuals that construct the transnational field of conservation. So what we have is, with their increased connectedness, is that the American concerns for wilderness protection and the European concerns for species protection converge in a process what institutional scholars would refer to as structuration. They are connected and they become influenced. And our concept of the natural environment arises in the 40s and 50s precisely as a consequence of these two views converging. Even today, if you look at the definition of wilderness in the American legislation, which is in the 1960s, it doesn't mention species. It defines wilderness as a tract of space or of the environment. So there are other trends which are important, but I'll just skip that. So the question is then, we have this field, it's constructed by these individuals, there is a convergence process and the new construction of an environmental concept in which you have these great tracts of land, these mountains, this river, the idea of Yosemite or Yellowstone, and also species. Now the second question is, well, now we know how it emerges and the individuals that were associated to it. The second question is, how is it related to the international system? Or the idea of embeddedness. How is the network of individuals and organizations related to the global international system? And therefore explains how it diffuses across the world. So I used data from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is the main organization associated with international conservation. Many of you may be familiar with it. And I took the data proceedings, as data, I took the proceedings between 1948 and 2000, precisely the moment in which the international field of conservation was constructed, to see how the international system of conservation evolved, to show you that it's not static. So here we have NGO participants from 1950 to 1994, and you'll see here that these are the participants of NGO organizations. And you'll see here that there's there's an increasing trend here, it goes down, and then there's this exponential process in which these new actors are involved. And you see different regions. So here in blue you have US and Western Europe, what we'd call the cultural core, where these concepts are emerging and emanating to the rest of the periphery. But you see, as we move to 1994, the percentage of environmental NGOs that are coming from the cultural core, if you will, are a minority. Now we have Latin Americans, we have the Caribbean, we have Africa, we have the countries that are associated with the periphery. So this is the structure by which this process of diffusion occurs. Let me show you these network diagrams, which my advisor hates, but I show them because I think they're fun. And you'll see in blue here that blue are the colors of the cultural core, that is the United States and Western Europe. And in yellow you have individuals from what's known as the periphery. And here are the meetings of the IUCN. Now, where the meeting was held is the square and the year. So this would be in a periphery country. This was in Venezuela. So obviously more people from Venezuela are going to these meetings. But what's interesting here is the people that are always going to the meeting, what we could call the epistemic community. Okay? So this guy here is very important. He's at the center of this network. He's gone to all these meetings, and he's from Europe or Western or the United States. In this case, it's the United States. So you see that it's these guys that are influencing the rest of the network. Who are these guys? Well, these guys are precisely the same guys that we saw at the beginning. So we have here Coolidge, we have Bernard, we have a series of individuals in which we know their history, and they're coming from Switzerland, they're coming from Europe, they're coming from the United States, and they are influencing the structure of this network. They are central figures. So the question is, well, they are the cultural imposers, as you will. They are imposing the cultural values. They're imposing these values associated with environmental conservation. But if we take that network in the 90s, we'll see that it changes. Now we have these guys. You see light blue, which are people from the Canada, Australia, South Africa. You have in yellow people from the periphery, Latin America, Africa, and so forth. These are individuals. These are the meetings. It's becoming more legitimated. There are more people involved. But now you see that the people at the core, or what I've called the epistemic community, the carriers of these institutional values, are changing. They are individuals that are coming from the periphery, and therefore consequently affecting the nature of the environmental regime. Here we have another way of looking at this. These are individuals associated with the epistemic community. The epistemic community in blue are the individuals that are precisely in the middle of these meetings, and the total population is in red. As you can see two things in this diagram. One is that the number of people that are coming from Western Europe, both in the epistemic community and in the total population, is increasing significantly. Decreasing significantly, I'm sorry. And you're also seeing that they are statistically different as well, with the exception of this one. So we're seeing that statistically, the people at the core are members of the cultural center, the United States and Western Europe, and therefore from which we have emanating these values. But in the 1990s, this is no longer the case. Not only are they less relatively, but also the members of the community, of the epistemic community, are not necessarily statistically different from the total population. We have the same thing with government organizations. Now, as you can see, non-government, this you have to read the other way around, non-government organizations are the majority. Government organizations are very little, are very few, 5%, 10%, and so forth. It increases a little bit in the 1970s as we have increased government interest in the environment, but then it goes back to its original sort of trend around 15, 20%. So what we have is at the core, we don't have government organizations. This is essentially an environmental regime associated with non-state actors who at the core are originally European and Americans, and then later become much more diffused with members of the periphery. Here is another way of looking at this. This is the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and you'll see here that once again we have the epistemic community at the center. Mainly blue, as you can see, but in the 80s and 90s, this changes remarkably. The question is, that we're trying to gauge from here is to say, well, we do not have a static environmental regime. The environmental regime changes as it interacts with different nation states, and those individual participants become involved with the environmental regime. What are its implications? Here we have the percentage of the organizations, which is also consistent with that analysis. What are the implications? Well, the implications are that the policies associated with the environmental regime evolve and change. They may not evolve explicitly. The regime is still, for example, recommending national parks. But the idea behind the national parks is different, because the members of the periphery are arguing that the way of looking at the environment must be different. Associated with this idea of structuration is what's called institutional logics. Again, a concept that comes from institutional theory, and I won't get into that very much, but the point is that as the regime changes and evolves, we have changing recommendations of the type of policies that are emerging from the regime. And associated with those policies are the way we view the environment, suggesting once again that the environment is essentially a socially constructed process. Here are another information that I coded. These are resolutions now from the proceedings between 1948 and 1996. These are, in those meetings that I showed you the participants, we also have resolutions, and the resolutions suggest what the concerns are of this community of people. A community that, as I've showed you, is changing over time, or at least the central figures of that community are changing over time. So initially, we have very few resolutions. It's an organization that is really being constructed, and by the late 90s, then there's a lot of resolutions. There are a lot of concerns. So look at the process of structuration here. What we have here is I'll show you some diagrams associated with these resolutions and how I've coded them. It'll become clear to you. But you see here we have the focus of conservation. What are their concerns? Well, initially their concern is flora and fauna protection. Not surprisingly, because the Europeans were dominant, okay, in the 1950s. And ecosystems habitat protection becomes increasingly important as the Americans become more dominant. Okay? But that peaks in 1970 and then it declines. The focus of conservation changes. Also, we have here the whys of the conservation. Why are you interested in conservation? This is all information that is associated with the resolutions that I've mentioned. Again, we have the 50s, the 60s, and 70s, and 90s. And what we see here is initial concern, you see, with there isn't much concern about why we're doing this. But as time passes, you'll see that unique species and universal values become more important. Tourism recreation declines, which was the original concern of the environmental conservationists. But look at this. Life support systems and regulate climate. Biodiversity becomes relevant. The environment is reconstructed as a system. And significantly, cultural local communities become important. Participation becomes important, and now the natural environment is understood as one in which, rather than being absent, humans are absent, as in the conception of wilderness of the Americans, or absent as in the case of white Europeans that are interested in the hunting. In neither of those images that I showed you, there were people involved. Now suddenly there are people. And you have to conserve with people. These are the principles associated with conservation. Gender and equity become increasingly important. Moral responsibility, precautionary principle, indigenous people, local communities and parks. So the principles associated with conservation are also changing as a consequence of that structuration process. What are the solutions for conservation? Now, originally the solutions were very much associated with national parks and protection. They tend to peak here, protect species and establish national parks. But as time goes by, these decline and new types of solutions emerge. Biosphere and World Heritage sites, and marine parks, and other types of conservation instruments. Let me sorry, is that going back? So let me just, I have about 2-3 minutes, and I'll obviously I didn't have time to do everything. Let me just say some of the solutions for conservation here is conservation with indigenous people, and you see once again that you have this relationship with communities in the environment. So in a sense, we have different stages of the structuration process. And you'll see these 5 stages. Stage 1, where there's a beginning with concerns with species, the deployment as the rise of environmental concerns, internationalization, institutionalization, and the institutional consistency as people react towards this environment without people and the environment. So the point I want to make here is that, reiterating my initial formulation, is that as this world regime changes, as a consequence of these actors being involved, we have both new actors being involved and a change in environmental regime, and this in turn, this environmental regime generates new policies as this feedback loop continues as a process of what I've termed of structuration. And then we observe that suddenly in the new policy recommendations, we have this image of wilderness which has people, has life related to the world ecosystem, very different from the original view we have of wilderness, and at the center, we have people and local communities. Now, I will finish very briefly by saying just 2 final things. First, that the diffusion process that I described initially is associated, on the one hand, with this changing evolution of the environmental regime, on the one hand, as new actors begin to interact. And secondly, the regime becomes more legitimated. That legitimation is associated with the individual actors in the periphery recognizing that they must justify the new regime on the basis of the discourse that's emerging from the world regime. I also coded, I don't have time to show all this to you, but I also coded national parks in Latin America. And it's an interesting sample because we have 296 legal documents, and we looked at the preambles of those national parks to see what the discourse was. And what we observe here is that the discourse is very much related to the concerns of the international system. So initially there are concerns for recreation, which decline. As recreation does not become important, becomes less important in the world system. We also have, in the case of Latin America, concern for service protections, environmental services, water protection, forest protection, and again, these decline. But as the regime, and when in the 1950s and 60s, species protection becomes important, we see here that there's this rise in species protection in the concerns. And finally, we have sustainable development, biodiversity. Okay? So what we have is this relationship between individual actors that are drawing from the regime the discourse and are justifying their establishment of their protected areas on the basis of those logics, those institutional logics. These are all from the actual legal establishment of these national parks. I will just finish with this. What does this mean in terms of the actual practice of these policies? And this is very interesting because as I began, we had this environmental regime that was essentially static. And as I hope I've convinced you, that regime is evolving as a question of new individual actors are participating, and it changes the logics associated with that regime. Here I have 4 case studies which I examined in detail. If you're interested, you can look at the book. And what you'll realize here is that in each of these countries, the actual practice changes depending on the logics of those specific countries. So each country uses the same discourse and justifies national parks in terms of the logics of the international regime, on the one hand, but on the other hand, the actual implementation of those policies depends on the institutional logics behind those individual countries. So in the case of Argentina, which is a good example, national parks are essentially a vehicle to deal with frontier conflicts with Chile. So there's a lot of national park occupation, establishment, and effective implementation. In the case of Chile, there's perhaps the country that established most protected areas in this initial period. There's absolutely complete decoupling. There is no implementation because it's not consistent with the individual logics of those countries. In the case of Mexico, you have two peaks establishments of protected areas, one in national parks associated to the Cárdenas periods in 1930s, and it's very closely associated with the protection of environmental services, particularly water resources. As that doesn't become important, again, it loses priority and becomes decoupled. So let me just finish here very briefly and just give you some final points. My point of departure is that environmental reform has become widespread, and that is interesting in itself. There has been just a remarkable institutional change in both policies and regulations, but also norms and the way we view the world in the last century. This is just a remarkable change and not consistent with the way countries have actually implemented these policies. Institutions involve rules, norms, and cultural constructs that frame social action. And viewing environmental forms as organizations is useful because it allows us to think of these as as organizations that are within institutional systems and see how they evolve. As they evolve, they become legitimated and replicated, and that explains the replication and therefore explains the decoupling. So let me just conclude by saying, where do these institutions come from? Well, they depend on the institutional context in which they emerge. The role of, they change as new actors become involved within the context of organizational fields, which play a central role in converging meaning systems and emanating these policies. Who are the institutional carriers? Well, they're individuals and organizations that become central elements in these networks of organizations, carrying those cultural values. As they change, also the concerns, policies, and organizational systems associated with these institutions also change. This also explains decoupling and implementation. I will only finish with this finally and let you away. Here there is a few policy implications. There is a positive story associated with globalization. Typically we think of globalization as a threat. And here what we find is that globalization and international forums have been essential to legitimate environmental policies and are essential explanation of this enormous diffusion of environmental concerns. However, they are extremely decoupled. And resource constraints are only part of the problem. The decoupling or the lack of implementation is associated precisely with the diffusion process. Non-state actors remain central to the global diffusion of those environmental reforms, both at the level of the environmental regime, but also domestically. However, there is a problem or a challenge. Unless we reinterpret those global trends within the domestic institutional logics, as you can observe with the case studies I looked at, then these policies will remain decoupled or non-implemented. Therefore, the recent trend, for example, international environmental NGOs that are actually implementing these policies directly is a major problem. Thank you very much. Are you going to? For about 10 minutes of questions. Okay, we have some questions. Sorry that it was so long. Let me just, before the questions, make some acknowledgements. And I would like to thank a lot of people. I don't have time to thank all of you, but I would especially like to thank the people from the E-IPER program, especially Helen, Danielle, who came. Where are you, Danielle? Oh, there you are. Thank you very much. And Jen, of course, that you've helped us organize this. I would also like to thank Woody, who's given me bad looks as I have taken too much time. The members of my committee, Rodolfo and Sarah, who have been so kind, and especially Dick Scott and Rosamond Naylor, who have given me their wonderful support. Finally, I'd like to thank Amanda, Mariana, and Sofia, who are here with us today, and my wife, who, without their support and above all patience, I would not be here. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah.
So, thanks a lot. It was a great presentation. One of the things I was curious about, it seems one of your main points is that through increased participation of members from the periphery, they've really, through structuration, changed the conservation policies and maybe the focus of conservation in the international community. I'm not entirely convinced that that change in focus is representative of their priorities. It seems, to some extent, that change in focus might just represent other social movements, gender equality, indigenous rights movements, or changes in the science. Global warming has become more of a priority among the scientific community. And so I'd be curious if you could kind of elaborate a bit on why you think that's a direct link to the priorities of the members of the group.
Well, that's a good question. My main point is that there are 2 points. The first point is that we shouldn't conceive of the environmental regime as static. There is evidence that it's not static. It's influenced by both global institutional processes. For instance, the rise of women's rights suddenly begins to appear in the environmental movement. Doesn't seem to be very relevant initially, but then it becomes relevant. Or other concerns which are global, human rights, for instance. And they influence the environmental regime. So the idea of thinking of the environmental regime as something that is constructed and that just unidirectionally gives you the truth is a bad way. So you have these global trends that are coming and are affecting this field. And secondly, you have what I've emphasized here is that the individual actors that participate and become more involved, they also have an effect. So that's why this is referred to as a structuration process. It's a give and take. There are agents, there are actors, they have interests, they're affected by these global trends. The point is that in this, and here the concept of arena is perhaps more appropriate, in this arena in which you have give and take, in which you have conflict, in which you have some scholars refer to as challengers and incumbents. You have that process, you have this ultimate solution which emerges from that field. I wouldn't want to suggest that this is a completely benign process in the sense that suddenly all the periphery members become much more influential. I'm just saying that they do become somewhat influential, and it's that influence in that process which generates those new policies and concerns. Also, I'd like to say that I think it's not only important to think about the policies that are emerging, but how we are conceiving the natural environment. What you see is both the influence of the policies that are recommended, but also how the world is being viewed. And the natural environment is very differently conceived today as a consequence of that saturation process than it was before.
I think you offer a really, really nice framework to look at the change over time, and it would be fascinating to extend it into the 2000s because of technology changes with basically a flattening, so you could get more international audience because of Skype and people not having to pay so much money to get there, so the ideas can be seen by other people who otherwise won't have access. So I would bet that you're going to see a stronger trend over time for continuing this, and that's really nice to offer it now. My question goes back to the beginning when you were looking at some of the drivers of these trends, and I'm wondering if you looked at the size of countries. I think the GDP or some aspects of GDP were in there. If you looked at a percentage of GDP that is related to tourism activities, because I imagine international tourism would drive a lot of this.
I didn't look at specifically at that, but generally these studies, what they refer to as connectedness. So they've used different proxies for that. In this case, I used information associated with the country levels participation in international organizations. But also I used exports and imports and looked at that as a measure of the connectedness. You could conceivably use of tourism, but the problem with tourism is that it's only recently been an important variable. So that was one of the problems. But certainly the question is, who are the carriers? And you have these global migration processes, tourism, and international forums. And all of those, you can see the connectedness associated with them. The case of Costa Rica, which I didn't have time to mention, is especially interesting. And one asks the question, why is it that Costa Rica has become a paradigmatic case in conservation policy around the world? And one of the explanations that you observe in the case study is that there, for different reasons, and not really related to environmental issues at all, in Costa Rica, there was a series of organizations that established themselves and facilitated that connection, and therefore generated the conditions for the conservation policy that came afterwards. So, I mean, you're right.
I didn't look specifically at tourism, but it's the connectedness.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about this was very much a sort of core and periphery story.
Yes.
And I was thinking about it from the perspective of having been in New Zealand. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and how you were thinking about their roles and how you were particularly thinking about that US and Europe, given the very early history of parks and the just sort of how you'd break those three out, given the core periphery story you were telling here.
Well, it's a great question. I did think about that very specifically, because what happened with those four countries, which I refer to as CANs, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, is that in that initial period, they are the individuals that are representing the core, and you can name them, are also representing those countries. So to think of them as periphery is kind of difficult. Because essentially it's the same individuals. And so that's why you have this just strong influence that initially national parks moved from United States and the colonies towards these newly independent countries that are essentially connected. So the first park after Yellowstone is in Canada, the next one is in New Zealand, I believe, and then Australia. And you see that connection. Now that changes over time because these countries become more independent, and you see that these new individuals that are representing these countries are actually Canadian, are actually New Zealanders rather than expats. Now that's why I thought Latin America was more interesting, because it didn't have that connection, and it was also a country that were independent much earlier on than African countries, and yet you see the same processes.
I was curious how your theory of diffusion and structuration within environmental regimes fits within other international normative regimes. So, I mean, if you take a broader sense of, did you look at anything else like the proliferation of human rights as a regime itself, or if you were to take this and bring it into context of that literature?
Well, actually, it's the other way around. There is a lot of work on education, a lot of work on human rights, a lot of work on women's rights that shows this same process, a process of structuration. There is a famous paper on human rights which is called The Paradox of Empty Promises, which precisely shows this process of diffusion in which countries are adopting human rights regimes. And it's a paradox because they're not really interested in human rights, but the relationship with non-state actors influence them anyway, and there is an improvement in human rights as a consequence. So it's the other way around in the sense that there's not a lot of work being done on the environment about this.
Yeah, and I guess I was just curious what might be different about the environmental regime in comparison to these other.
Well, what I think is interesting about the environment is that associated with the environment, and in particular conservation, you have very closely linked the policies, but also the vision of what the natural environment is. So there's a social construction of the environment, and you see that very clearly with the idea of the national park. which initially, as I showed you in the first images, it's very much related to, the Americans have this view of this wilderness idea without any species. The Europeans have this idea of no wilderness in a sense, but just species. And then that evolves. So you have an evolution of both policies, but also how you view the world. And that's, I think, what makes it particularly interesting. Yeah.
You showed that the kind of participation with IUCN, you kind of showed that the change in the type of countries represented there kind of coincident with the change in the justification for certain conservation policies in national parks. I mean, can you talk a bit about the specific mechanisms that relate this participation to this change in outcomes, or like at least justification for outcomes, and maybe why specifically the participation of developing countries led to these specific changes in justification in terms of moving towards more sustainable development, perhaps, or indigenous concerns.
The outcomes in specific countries, you mean?
The outcome in terms of justification, those line graphs that you have.
Well, what you see, that's the other way of looking at this, which hasn't been done really, is to look at specific countries. There's not a lot of study with specific countries. So what you observe is that correlation or coincidence between the discourse of the regime and the discourse of these specific countries. They are all these policies or the adoption of these organizations are justified on the basis of the international regime. And you can see that very clearly. When recreation is a problem, then recreation is a problem in these specific countries. When, as you saw with national parks, when sustainable development is a problem, then sustainable development is also a problem in these specific countries. Now, that doesn't mean they're actually implementing those national parks. The countries that actually implement the national parks, and you look specifically at the cases, and you find that they're implementing them because of other reasons. So, for instance, the case of Mexico is one. It's very clear. I mean, they're interested and concerned with water conservation, and they use national parks, but they say the same thing. They say, we're conserving national parks because of monuments, this and the other. But actually, national parks are very small, and they're specifically associated with water resource conservation. In the case of Argentina, it's the same. They say, well, we're doing this because of monuments, we're doing this because of recreation, but actually they're conserving, they're trying to occupy the frontier because they have a conflict with Chile. So what you see is that in specific countries, the implementation is associated with their specific concerns, but they are all drawing from the international regime's discourse. The case of Chile, once again, is important because Chile does everything. It's connected, it's drawing everything in, and yet it doesn't implement anything because there's no overt reason to justify or to implement those national parks. Is that what you meant?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, as there's more participation in the international regime, does that lead to increase in implementation and a reduction in this decoupling?
It does. It does as well. Yes, and you see that in the case studies. There is a certain convergence. There are two types of convergence. Convergence in the formal policies, but also a convergence in closing the gap between decoupling. Yes, you see that too. But you can only see that by looking specifically at the case studies. Thank you, Will.